God. Okay, awesome. I think we're all set here. So maybe we could start by introducing ourselves.
That would be great. Ladies first.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Missy. I go by Boudoir Yoga and also the Body Intuitive on Instagram. I am a rehabilitative mobility coach, more recently a sovereign sexuality coach. I also do body work and Ayurveda, Reiki, all sorts of alternative holistic healing modalities. And mainly what I do is I help people improve mobility, relieve pain, and reduce stress. And also that study has taken me into this practice of sovereign sexuality, where I've learned a lot more in my practice of specializing and working with men. I've learned a lot more about the importance of touch and healthy touch in life, and how that leads deeper into the field of sexuality and intimacy and relating to each other. So my practice is truly holistic in many senses. So
it totally sounds like it.
yeah, so that's me and what I do. It's kind of hard to envelop into a cool, catchy terms. So if you guys come up with one, I'm accepting. I'm accepting bids.
Well, you know what's interesting? It's like it is not easy to just label human the human experience of just. I mean, touch itself. You know, it's so elementary. It's foundational to our mental health. We're finding. You know, for anybody listening, I was interested in Missy's work because she speaks about men and sexuality, and that's where I kind of am in my own journey. As I'm coming through the other end, which is like from weightlifting and kind of machismo culture and like dissociative behaviors, like to get things done. And I made my way back to my own body through having a sex and intimacy coach, but also learning to dance again. And the softer yin practices, like, I mean, you couldn't have asked me to do yoga like 5 years ago. But my best friend, Tony, who we have in common, is actually an instructor. Hey, Tony, he's in like an hour or two, but, and there's that connection. And so I started to see how the worlds were blending, and that's why I'm curious. I want to hear what you are offering to the world and like, what's kind of interesting to you.
Yeah, so I think that's a great introduction, and I'm so just happy for you that you've given yourself this space and opportunity to grow and explore some of these things, because a lot of people don't even get to that point. And so there's so much shame around these topics, and that's one of the main messages I like to bring, is just to first bring it to the light by discussing it in the first place. So it's like these kinds of interactions where some of the really big shifts can happen. So just a little bit of background on me and my history and like how I arrived at this subject and specializing in working with men. So when I first started teaching, it was I thought I was going to be helping people with autoimmune digestive diseases like myself.
Ayurvedic,
like Ayurvedic stuff. So I have a lot of training in that, and yoga therapy and like in that kind of thing. And so that was originally my start. And then throughout all these trainings, I would look around the room and there would be like, a bunch of women and almost like no guys.
Yeah,
and
totally.
I'd be like,
totally.
What is with this? Like why are things this way? And I actually never really got a satisfactory response to that. It was just like, oh, it's marketed to women or this, that, the other thing. And I started doing a really deep dive into that question because I had to write a thesis paper for one of my yoga therapy trainings. And so I literally wrote my thesis on yoga for men. But when I started to do research on this, there was like almost no, clinical or even academic level research. And so I was just like, I can't believe this is such a like edgy field or progressive field. So I was still not satisfied, and I basically just did my own, and I conducted, hundreds of hours of interviews with male students and male yoga practitioners and senior male teachers. I did a lot of like intersectional research on the neurology of cultures, sociocultural implications, the gender dynamics of what does it mean to be a man or a woman. And so essentially I just whittled all of that down, and also just like enveloping what is happening in the medical fields, like how men and women seek out and receive treatment or therapy or help for their pain in different ways. And so basically what I realized is that men aren't going to yoga and they're not going to therapy. And so here I was as a yoga therapist.
Yeah, they do
like,
not
all
do
right.
self-help stuff. I mean, that is sort of the elephant in the room. Is like, you know, crazy men are doing crazy things in this country because they're not getting any
the help that they need.
Right. And it's very scary to talk about. It's very edgy, but you're going to the root of it, which is like, what's going on inside of them? Why are they hiding? Right.
Right, exactly, because change out there in the world starts within us, and we know that, right? But then comes the real work of having to look inside of us. And what I realized from my research was that men are told to stuff emotion, they're told to repress, they're told that these things are feminine and therefore weak and therefore something to be ashamed of.
Yes.
You know, or they get made fun of with their buddies. You know, there's just not a lot of safe places for men to process their emotions. And so when it's not that the emotions don't happen, they're still human beings, but they either get repressed or the only acceptable emotion is anger. And so you see like violence start to escalate in communities. You know, you'll see more increased cases of sexual assault. So all of these things are evidence-based claims. So I'm not just like kind of pulling it out of my
there's statistics
my
to
back
back it
end.
up,
There's statistics to back it up from a lot of different areas of research and study. And so it just seems, and like even in the opioid epidemic right now, we have an epidemic of pain in our society, and pain is not a really well understood thing right now in the general population. It's a very complex phenomenon. People have pain for different reasons, and I think men especially have a hard time coping with that because they're told if you have pain, then you're weak. And so then you just have to deal with it. And so they'll like, you know, not get the help that they need, like you said, and become really disconnected from their bodies, really disconnected from their hearts. And so that's why for men, some of the top two killers are cardiovascular issues. You're not connected to your heart space, literally, and suicide. Guys are really depressed. They're really lonely.
And they have enough guts to actually do it. You know, like they really believe that is the answer. And, you know, I do know lots of guys who are totally machismo and in the military, like in the Marines, and it's no biggie to just pop like ibuprofen, like 1,000 milligrams or some crazy, like almost like Vicodin status, just like pop a pill and just say nothing. And then, you know, there's a suicide epidemic amongst vets, and because there's that stuffing, it's like, it's not culturally okay if you're identified as a male to say that anything is hurting or anything is wrong.
Right, because you have to be the provider, you have to be the protector, you have to fulfill all of these roles that society is putting onto you, and you may or may not identify as that. So I think, you know, and especially this comes out in our relationship to touch. Like I work with people, I have several students who are veterans and have PTSD and work with all these things, and trauma, regardless of whether you're male or female, can create the same symptoms, but how we cope with those traumas can differ greatly for men versus for women. And so for men, it really is this process of reintegrating back into their bodies. A lot of men are very disconnected from their root, and so that is actually kind of the first thing I would say for sovereign sexuality, and it ties directly back into this conversation, because in order to look at sovereign sexuality and say, okay, this is something that resonates with me and I would like to adopt a lifestyle in alignment with the values and principles of sovereign sexuality, you have to be an embodied person. Like you have to be self-aware, you have to know what's going on in your body, you have to have a strong connection to that in order to be able to offer that same connection to another person. And so that's why I say the core principle of sovereign sexuality is that you always and ultimately first and always belong to yourself. You are as a sovereign being and your own autonomy, your own free thinking being, have autonomy over your own body. That's what it means to be a sovereign. So we think about sovereignty in terms of like nations, usually like their own ability to function independently and be considered a thing, right? So that is the same concept when we come into discussing sexuality, which is that is that person's body. They have their own set of values and beliefs
Right.
and choices and preferences and personal history. And so
Their own laws. Like if you're a country, you have
yeah,
customs
you have
and
your own
laws,
laws, right? Exactly. In
own
different
your own thing.
cultures. And
Yeah.
so it's the same thing. It's like this mixing and intermingling of energies. And like, just like countries coexist together, we as people also coexist together. And so in honoring each other's sovereignty, there's a certain dynamic that happens. But if we don't know what it feels like to be in our own energy, to be grounded in our own space, then it's very difficult to proceed. So especially with men, honestly, regardless of whether it's a mobility injury or their love life, I usually start with grounding, a lot of grounding type energy work, and a lot of like yoga practices that are very grounding, so that they can begin to have what's called interoception and feel what's going on in their bodies and begin to familiarize themselves with those sensations and interpret them. And then once that interpretation, that biofeedback process is not so scary anymore, because you can imagine a guy who's like never sat with his feelings before. Like this is a really intimidating process, because it's like
right, like
opening a can of worms, you know, like you open up the little bit and it just goes like pooh, you know.
Yeah, totally.
So I get it, but we gotta let it out, because otherwise it's going to explode anyway. And so, you know, let's drip it out through a controlled environment rather than having it explode onto the people that you care about the most, which is what happens.
No, yeah, and I mean, so even that sounds like a pretty advanced step, like getting somebody in the door. Is what would you say,
Yeah.
like even if they don't know it, what would you say like the surface reason is they come to see you? Like, is it massage, you know, or is because, you know, there's
pain, stress.
Pain. So pain is the starting, like,
Yeah.
like, you know, my shoulder, like, what are the areas that are super common that you're just like, bingo,
yeah, I would love for guys. I'm so happy when this happens. It doesn't happen very often, but I love when guys come to me and are like, you know, I felt this thing start to get worse. I wasn't sure what was going on, so I decided to see somebody about it. That's very rare. That's a very proactive approach. That's a very like
that's not the norm.
Healthy, I'm going to put myself first and practice good self-care approach. That's not the norm. On the other end of the spectrum, which is I think where most of us fall, and especially men, is I'm not going to address something until it's screaming for my attention.
Yeah, I'm like,
and it's so bad and layered and complex that I really need a lot of help to untangle this and rehabilitate.
So that's the starting point. Like, okay, so pain.
Pain.
Right. So say you have this person and they don't know about the principles of sovereign. Like they're just like, I don't know. I just heard she was a good massage therapist or someone to go to.
Sure.
What would you then kind of like start to ask them? Like, what would you be curious about and start to talk to them about?
Well, with my guys, with my male student, I call them my guys because I think about all my students as kind of, you know, my people.
You guys.
Yeah, they're my guys. So the first place that we'll start is usually with their physicality, because I think that is a very strong suit for men, is they are very physically driven. A lot of them like to be hands-on. A lot of them like to use their bodies to feel like they're accomplishing something and to achieve that even that small sense of satisfaction of like, oh, I did this thing today. And so we'll usually start the conversation there. And then also for me as a therapist or as a clinician, it's easier for me to measure physical improvements and then present tangible outcomes and say, okay, you know, your shoulder mobility improved by 20 degrees range of motion. And then once they trust me to work with their bodies, they know that, you know, they're going to feel better with me. Maybe their physical pain has decreased, so now they have more brain space to deal with emotional pain, right? Because it's really hard to kind of sit with things if your back is just killing you all the time. So it's like, we want to relieve that first. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes when guys come in and they have they're really cranked up about something or just cranked up in general, you know, I'll usually get them on the table and do more touch therapy, because with touch therapy and massage work, body work, that kind of thing, I can bypass the thinking mind, which a lot of guys really struggle with, and communicate with their nervous system more directly through my touch. And so if somebody's just really, really stressed out, that's usually the tool that I use, because the way that I work, I don't really do like a lot of talk therapy. If somebody wants to share with me what's going on with them to whatever extent they want to share, I welcome that and I hold space for that. But my approach and treatment is really about a felt embodied somatic experience first. So if somebody's feeling okay within themselves, I consider that to be the priority outcome rather than talking through something.
Feeling
because guys
okay.
usually, yeah, like feeling okay instead of being like, oh, because guys don't like talking out their feelings that much. It's hard for them to do that sometimes.
And like, there's lots of reasons why that. There's cultural, there's biological, there's also just, it's a skill too.
It is. So it's like if somebody's coming to therapy because they lack the skills to be able to connect with and communicate their emotions, why would I as the therapist then ask them to do that? It's like kind of setting them up for failure. So we're going to use other methods.
Right. And the mind is a tricky thing, right? Like, but they need that kind of rational, like, oh, I'm going to improve my shoulder by, because internal rotation or whatever. And you can hang their mind onto that. But it sounds like you speak to another part of them that is super important. And that's where I want you to kind of like, what does that mean? Like when you start to do touch therapy, like some people could think that's sexual or like, what does that mean?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have to be very, very aware of the dynamics in the situation. So usually you will start with more like physical things, and then the other stuff will just naturally come up anyway. They'll because that trust has to be established first, right?
Sure.
So through time, usually, I mean, for the most part, guys aren't coming in just like laying it all out. It's like they'll.
No.
Like in the same way, a female student might come and be really needing to just get stuff off her chest. There needs to be safety of the containers. So in my environment, in my office, there's only us working together. And so there's nobody else here. I try to keep it a very serene environment, it's very quiet. And it really is just as a place for people to come home to themselves. So that's what I try to provide just in terms of like the container physically, and then also energetically, like, again, they have the space to let come up what needs to come up. And, for me, there's no judgment for that. It's an impersonal process for me because, it's not my process, but it is also, it also requires me to be really embodied in myself too. So all of the practices that I teach to my students, I practice myself. So in that essence, if somebody's coming in and we do touch therapy, which is like, to me, just the same thing as body work, what we might do is like, I'll have them lay on the table and then I'll just stand there and like put my 2 fingers on their shoulders and just rest at the top of the table. This is, sometimes you'll see this in Reiki sessions too. And then I'll ask them to breathe. Okay. And then I'll cue them and coach them through the breath, because if somebody's holding and restricting their breath, then I can't go in and do deep tissue work on them from a biomechanical perspective.
Right.
So I try to work with somebody's natural energy. And so if they're holding a lot, or if they start like flinching and stuff, that's signaling to me as a therapist that their nervous system is really cranked up. And so just from lots of study and time and practice, I will feel in their bodies where they're holding that energy, where they're holding that tension, and then go to that space. And then sometimes I can't work into that space because they're not ready for it yet. And so I kind of have to work around it and integrate several other areas, because a lot of times things are really layered, and then we'll finally go into that space. So that could work over the period of one session, or it could be over a period of several months. Everybody opens at their own pace, and I'm just kind of guiding that process. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm bringing their awareness to places where they do not have awareness, and I'm asking them to breathe into that space, and I'm asking them to transform their relationship to that space within them too. So within that process, we may not actually discuss what's going on, but the energetics will shift the situation anyway. And so I think you're doing a great job of listening, by the way. So thanks for letting me ramble.
No, this is good. It's good to hear you talking about this freely, because
Thank you. I appreciate that, having this this outlet for it. Yeah. So say like we're in a session and I feel something sexual come up and it's a male student, right? This happens quite frequently actually.
Right. I would, yeah, I'm sure it does.
It does. It does. So I'm going in with the mentality that this is probably going to come up, especially if they're having difficulties in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I don't take that energy on. It's not for me, it's their energy. So it's like I'm working with that to cycle it within themselves and say, okay, the principles of sovereignty are that this is first and foremost always for you. And so I might ask them to breathe that up into their heart and then back down and root, and then breathe up into the heart and root down again. And I'll just be working around their body the rest of the time. And I think, it could have a sexual feeling to it, but it's not a sexual act in the sense of the energy is just being moved, if that makes sense. So there's kind of like a release in the sense of the underlying need is being met, and it doesn't necessarily have to be met through a sexual act. It could just be a need for touch. It could be a need for
Bingo.
for presence. It could be a need for intimacy. And so being in a dark room with somebody whose attention is fully on you and is just asking you to breathe and like let these feelings and stuff come up for you, like that's healing and therapeutic in itself. So like, there's no need for a happy ending. Like that is the happy ending. Like that's just the situation. That's the deeper desire that's there. And I don't really see that as like a sexual thing. I just see that as more of like an energetic, emotional need that every human has. So I guess I'm just a lot less afraid of it.
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying this because I truly believe there's a strong genderization for men to only have sex and feel their emotions that way. Like it is the only
Right.
sanctioned outlet is a sexual act. Even if like, I know
Right.
this is true for myself, that sometimes I just wanted somebody to just hold me and say nothing. I didn't know that that was okay. One, I didn't know that that was an actual need as a human, because I was programmed to think that I'm a robot and I only get to, put my penis in things. And that's how I
Right.
feel.
You are a computer. The brain is the operating software, and your sole purpose in life is to like put your penis in things. It's just like you are worth so much more than that. Like that is not your sole purpose in life. You have so many unique contributions. You have so many gifts to offer to this world. And, speaking about sexuality, a lot of men who are sexually frustrated also don't know what their purpose is in life. There's a strong correlation between the two. And so when a guy like knows what his purpose is, like his sexual drive is going to be there because he just has this drive for life in general, and he's like anchored in his masculinity. It's really, really interesting. So like, I feel like, going down this road, I just opened up this like rabbit hole of male psychology that I was just really not privy to before.
And I think that's really cool though, because, right now it is not a cool time to be a guy. It's just, there's not a lot of good press on our behalf. And I do think that it's important that we, I saw a meme that was like, we don't need more gentlemen in the world. We need more men to go do peyote in the woods and come back humbled. And I was like, that's probably what we all need to do in some shape or form. Doesn't need to be a psychedelic, but it does need to be going to those.
Getting in touch with yourself, like having a spiritual experience and giving yourself permission and space to have those experiences. Because in those experiences, you learn empathy, you learn compassion, you learn loving kindness towards yourself. And so a lot of the guys will describe their work with me as being very opening. You opened me to a perspective I didn't see before, or you opened me to understanding the feminine, or you helped open my shoulder up, right? So, that might not be at a physical level what's actually happening. There's different science behind that. But the point is, like, it's like putting yourself into this man box, and you're only allowed to feel these certain things. And then it's like, oh, it's safe to explore outside this box. And not only is it safe, but it's actually encouraged for me to do that. And I'm not going to be shamed for it. And I feel so much happier and like in my masculine for that. And so I kind of just, I don't punch the bear. I just kind of poke at the bear and use my knowledge
good.
to kind of like because I like my approach to it too is like, I'm not going to come in and tell a guy how to feel. I'm not going to project my experience onto him. I'm not going to like, I'll give my clients tough love. I'll be like, you know what, you got to let her go, or like, you know, we'll set firm boundaries, those types of things. But I'm not going to project my experience onto him. That's for him to decide. And so basically, I'm just putting up a little pressure against some of the tender points, and then I'm releasing back, and then putting more pressure on, and then releasing back. And so that could happen emotionally, that could happen physically, that could happen through massage, right? And it again just brings this level of awareness to what's happening in a way that he doesn't necessarily need to be able to communicate in order to benefit from. And I think going through that process only through a felt experience can he then understand, oh, now I can apply this to another person in my life. So I think like one of the best compliments my clients has given me was like, after, you know, 6 or 7 sessions of working with him, we had, I think, like an hour and a half bodywork session where I brought him in for a massage. We did a lot of like Reiki, we did a lot of energy healing. And I know it sounds really woo-woo, but we really did. It was a lot of energy that moved. And he came back the next week. We had another session. And then it was only at the very end of that session, as he's like walking out the door, that he like turns around to me. He's like, oh, did I tell you? Like, after our session last week, I just had this whole like epiphany about how I was treating my girlfriend kind of poorly and like not treating her the best way that I could. So I've just been so much more like appreciative of her and like feeling this much more like loving towards her. And I think you like really opened me up in this way. And I had like a really good cry about it. And so, yeah, I just want to let you know. And he like runs, you know, like
He was like, oh, I'm going to feel shy after this. I'm going to go. But you got the gold. Yeah, like that's probably right. What you live for. It's like that moment where you're like,
oh, yeah, it was so good. I was like,
right,
yeah. So, I mean, like I felt all of those things in our session, and you know, I try to give people a little time after just to like kind of come back to themselves and be like, okay, is there anything you want to talk about? Usually just be like a few minutes, but I don't always get that feedback from them. So it was really nice to kind of get that, even if it was delayed. But yeah, you know, and like that was an experience where he derived it from his own inner sense of experiencing, and that shift happened within him. So yeah, I guess I'm just really good at like providing that kind of space for people, and I wasn't really sure how to like describe it or synthesize it, but sovereign sexuality is my attempt and my way at kind of formalizing this into a principled system where people can study these and be like, all right, how can I apply this to my life in a way that's healing and therapeutic for me, and at a timeline and at a scale that's healing and therapeutic for me. Because
in Guy Talk, that would be you're creating a training program.
Yeah, basically. So I'm going to create a step-by-step process.
And that just, they're like, okay, if, you know, like knowing they're builders and kind of that kind of task-oriented brain needs that. You know, I think that is because once they're in the door, you know, the gates will open, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I say the best way to experience something like this is just to find a provider that resonates with you, and yeah, just, you know, ask for what you want, or you don't be afraid to say that you don't know what you want or you don't know what you need.
Let's talk about that. Like you're talking about boundaries, and I don't think that is a topic that comes up a lot with guys. You know, the idea of boundaries, like our own and other people's, reading them. What are your thoughts on that, and having to do with, you know, the work that you're doing?
I think boundaries are everything.
I find that out, but I want you to tell people like why you think that's important.
Yeah, boundaries are super important, especially in this time of Me Too and figuring out what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman, how are we renegotiating this in gender dynamics and power equalities, especially in the bedroom, especially in our sexual relationships. It's a really, really important and good question. People think about boundaries as walls. That's a very primitive form of a boundary, right? So let's look at our commander-in-chief. You try to throw up a wall, somebody's going to climb over the wall, right? It's not a very effective boundary. So boundaries are less like walls or hard yes and no's than they are more like cell walls and into intelligent, dynamic, biodynamic, fluid structures.
They
So
can
with a
change.
cell, they can change, they can take shape, they're very fluid, they're extremely intelligent, they're very responsive and adaptive to their environment. That's why they're there. So I think about boundaries as like, the boundaries are there to protect and provide and systematically provide for what your core needs are as a person. So your needs as a human being are the infrastructure of your world, right? And so when needs are not being met, this is when relationships turn unhealthy, right? So maybe you've just been with somebody for a really long time and, you know, the excitement isn't there. And so you have a need for adventure and you go out looking for it. Or you have a need for touch that's not getting met in your relationship. And so you go out and like do things you thought you would never do because that is so strong. So needs are distinguished from desires in the sense of a need, a sacred need will not met until it's, or will not rest until it's met.
Okay.
A desire is something that you can do without. So it's not a have to. Right. And so there's different layers of needs, but in navigating soft sex relationships, I, as a sovereign being, come forward with saying, here are my needs, here are my boundaries. This is the container through which you are invited to meet me. Does that make sense? So the boundaries are the infrastructure, totally. The bridge from my needs to your needs. And boundaries are the rules of engagement, right? And so people have different boundaries. And where people overlap in their boundaries and have complementary needs, that tends to be a really healthy relationship. Where they don't overlap or needs are in conflict, those tend to be really, damaging or unhealthy relationships. And so we, again, first in soft sex, look to ourselves to ask what are our needs in the first place, right? If you're not connected with your body, if you're not connected with your emotion, it's really hard to know what your needs are. So first we do that work. And then soft sex is all about, okay, how do we consciously design relationships such that we not only maintain this infrastructure of boundaries, but also grow in it and support each other in building that infrastructure up for the people in the community around us. So it's a very, very respectful way to go about getting your needs met, where it inherently validates the worthiness of each party, even if those things are different.
Yeah, the way that something that clicked for me when I was learning about boundaries was, it's like your own self-care manual. It's like, this is how you would care for this type of dog, right? You know, like some dogs need to herd animals because it's their natural instinct. And they they have, like, some dogs like to dig, you know, it's like, but you have specifics that are to you and this other person, and being able to present them like, hey, this is just what it takes for me to feel good in this world, to feel safe. And it was so simple, but
it's
also
all about safety.
It is, but I also noticed that the one place that, I didn't even know this was a thing, but guys get asked to cross their own boundaries all the time in getting challenged. Like, and the number one place that happens, in the gym. They cross their own bound. I'm not comfortable lifting this, but do it anyway. Don't be a pussy, you know, like, and so they're asked to cross their own self-care boundary, and it's almost sanctioned, you know, instead of like, hey man.
Yeah, it's like the culture of the gym. It's just.
And what is that? A microcosm? It's something else. Like the gym is just an extension of it, but when you trace it back, it's boundaries, right? Like some people are just like, fuck your boundaries, fuck my own boundaries. Let's never follow them and let's have dysfunction. You know, do you know, like,
right. And those are difficult people to be around, because when somebody crosses your boundary, whether you're a man or a woman, it doesn't feel very good. It feels very invalidating. It feels very violating. It feels, it kind of makes you feel small and unimportant. And again, that need is still there, whether or not somebody acknowledges it and supports it. So I work at a gym. I teach one class a week, and that is very much the culture there. And I've seen other trainers, and like, I'm not going to name names or anything, but I've seen other trainers, like even in a class that I was taking, yell at a guy, be like, well, she just did, he was talking about me, he's like, she just did whatever, like 10 pull-ups and you can't even do one. And I was like, I almost stopped him because I was like, that's not fair. Like, I spend my whole life working on movement and fitness, and this is my life, you know, and like, and I teach here. And who cares if I'm a woman and do 10 pull-ups or not? Like, what is that a benchmark of any kind of meaningful information about who I am as a person? And then he's using that as an attack on this other guy whose response was, well, yeah, she can do it better than me. So now we're like pitted against each other. And like, how is that helping to motivate him when he's coming here to the gym to try to improve himself, and then getting yelled at how he's not improving himself good enough? Like, I didn't say anything because, again, it was just like the dynamics of the situation were really difficult. But I see this happen all the time, and it's so insidious and so pervasive in our culture in so many ways that it's just kind of like a running joke, you know, and like people laugh about it, but it's really, really actually very hurtful. And yeah, I just want to like tell everybody out there, like, your feelings are valid, you know, and the stronger we are in our own boundaries, the more we can either let those things kind of like roll off our chest, or know how to take inspired action without compromising our inner selves. And I think the challenge for men right now is that they see these things happening, they see the Me Too movement, they want to do something about it, but because they're struggling with their own disconnection, they're struggling with their own sexuality, their own sense of self-esteem and self-worth, it's hard to know how to go about something like that, much less have the strength and like kind of that warrior courage within yourself to then make a change in that situation, especially if you've been benefiting from that situation and the status quo and the way things have been. So I'm not going to ask a guy to do that. What I'm going to teach him is how to just be connected with himself, and he can figure out how to navigate that for himself, because everybody's going to do that in their own way. But again, if you return to these core principles of sovereignty, if you return to your breathing practices, if you return to this aspect of self-care and developing love and empathy for yourself and other people's experiences, these things become a lot easier to navigate. The path forward becomes a lot clearer, and then you can use that healthy masculine drive to clear those obstacles.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So it sounds like so far, you know, the principles like getting into your breath, which leads into your body. Once you can get a sense of that, you know, you can get a read on your own boundaries and your preferences, whatever they may be, starting with yourself, and then you can extend that forward. You know, in our email exchange, you've written something that stuck out to me, and it's intimacy is multidimensional. And you kind of were trying to define some of the terminology we were talking about. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because that struck me.
The multidimensionality of intimacy?
Right. Like, I'm just like, intimacy to me means like being this close to a person, you know, like, and I think for a lot of
closeness, people, right?
Yeah, like just closeness. But, you know, when you said it's multidimensional, I thought that was very fascinating.
Sure. Well, I mean, think about it this way. Like, think about, you know, the times in your life that you've had intimate situations. Like, what made them intimate for you? Was it that the person was like really up in your face, or was it that you shared some kind of experience together, or was it the way that they touched you? Was it, you know, just a feeling of closeness as a friendship? Like, what about those things felt intimate to you? And so in reflecting on these questions in my own experiences, I realized that we crave intimacy at different levels. And the deepest levels of intimacy are when we feel completely seen, heard, and understood by that other person on a physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental level, like for who we are as a complete human being, rather than a fragmented being. Like, oh, I feel very close to you intellectually, or like, you know, or we only have like an emotional intimacy, for example, like maybe there's not a sexual intimacy there. Or sometimes you could have a sexual intimacy with somebody without really having the emotional intimacy. So it's a very dimensional experience. And I personally prefer and try to guide my students towards opening themselves up to intimacy at all different layers of being. So some of us tend to struggle at certain layers more than others, and these tend to correlate with the layers where we have struggles with our boundaries. So there's that kind of like underlying thread all the way through each of these concepts. So
I definitely could, you know, because I lived in my head for a long time, so I could intellectually connect with friends and women that I was interested in, and also, but there was a sexual element, but I couldn't actually tell them who I was, like, you know, as a tender, like, basically share
the fear of being seen. Yeah.
Right, like the teenage boy version of me, like there where a lot of my preferences come from. I was just like, we're not talking about that, you know. And I didn't understand, like you were saying, there was different levels of intimacy, and you know, even sharing that I had fantasies, you know, like that were not related to porn or some, you know, that they were just like that having an erotic nature is something that is okay as a guy. Not just like,
it is,
you know what I mean? Like, and sharing that with someone who's like, oh my God, finally someone's saying something real. And I'm like, what do you mean saying something real? I don't even, I'm just taking a stab in the dark here.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you and so proud of your journey and your process, because that takes a long time for somebody to like have that kind of thought and then recognize it, like interact with it, and then be brave enough to like externalize it and share it with somebody else. Because there's a lot of fear around like shame and judgment, right? I grew up in a very Catholic environment, and you know, they taught abstinence in school, and so just like anything in that realm was just like insta shame. So I think people guilt themselves a lot for having the desires that they do. I mean, really, almost anything can be fetishized. I've heard so many different things, so it's probably not that crazy in the grand scheme of things, to be honest. You know, and even if it were, that's okay too. What we do with that desire can dictate a lot of the narratives that we tell ourselves around our sexuality. Like, oh, I will never find a partner who would be into this, or I will never be able to act on this, or maybe it is a thing where it's like, it's okay for this to remain a fantasy for me. I don't feel the need to act out on it. It just appeals to me on an intellectual level, and that's okay too. Like, so I think just like taking a step back here and beginning to explore like kinks and fetishes, alternative sexuality, having a community that's supportive of that is super, super helpful. Like somebody who's already been through the journey. And then I also encourage guys to think about like sexual orientation versus identity as a person. So sometimes somebody has a more fluid sexual orientation. So maybe you have some homosexual feelings, but you don't identify as a gay person, like that's allowed. Or because you hug a friend, that doesn't mean you're gay, right? Or like if a woman has a threesome, that doesn't mean she's bisexual, right? So everybody has, in soft sex, their own autonomy to decide not only what their preferences are, whether it's a fantasy or fetish, whatever, they can also decide where that takes them on the orientation. I feel like a lot more people are a lot more fluid than they might initially think themselves to be or allow themselves to be.
Sure.
But how much they take that on as a part of their identity caters or reflects much more of like their lifestyle and their sense of personhood than it does like you know, their label or their identity.
You're not the act that you do, like you try something, it doesn't make you,
it doesn't make you the thing, right? And so yeah, so I would just encourage people to think about sexuality as like a beautiful color wheel where there's all different flavors and varieties, and you know, you might find yourself like kind of dabbling in different shades of different colors, rather than this like black or white continuum of like straight or gay, or gay, or, you know, straight or lesbian, because in reality sexuality is a lot more fluid than that. And so I think about it as almost like water. Yeah, so you know, the river is going to run its path, but it's also going to flow up and push against the banks a little bit, and so the shape and the course of the river might change over time.
And would you say that this is more like higher level teaching, or like stuff you would introduce early on, or you know, in sovereign sexuality?
So I think because sovereign sexuality, because we're talking about sexuality, tends to go into this like really taboo mentality quickly. And so I kind of wanted to take some of that edge off of it and say, again, this is really about getting your sacred needs met. This is really about you knowing who you are as a person. This is really about being in genuine, healthy, authentic, intimate relationships and bringing you this sense of closeness and comfort. So it's not necessarily about like whips and chains and things like that too, but that's definitely one way to get really close to somebody, is to go through that kind of extreme experience with them, because it brings up a lot of this stuff. So in my soft sex course, we actually did a whole call on kinks and fetishes and alternative sexuality.
Yes.
We did a whole call on it, and it was honestly, it was really an honor to have the guys open up to me about what their different kinks and things were. And a lot of them were very, very self-conscious of them. And I think especially for guys, where a lot of the focus and narrative is around you have to please your partner, it's like within that, they forget that they themselves also have the right and ability to be pleased. And more likely than not, if they're with a partner, then that partner would also be willing to give them that pleasure or whatever it is, or you can at least have a conversation about it. Why not? So, and then on the other hand, the women in the women's group were saying like, he got so caught up in trying to please me that he was too in his head and too worried about what was going on to actually pay attention to me and realize that I was not enjoying the experience. And so then it's like this weird, like sideways energy where the guy's trying to please the woman and the woman's not liking it, but she's trying to like be in pleasure to please the man, and like everybody's stuck trying to please each other and nobody's actually having any fun. And I would say that's probably the worst situation.
It is the most common situation.
The most common and the worst situation. And so it's like, guys, like slow down, check in with each other, like make some eye contact. You know, it's like, if it's not a freaking it's not a race, you know, like it can be more about like what, again, helps you to feel connected, what helps you to feel sexy, what helps to turn you on. And I think tapping into those kinks and fetishes reflects some of your partner's greatest and deepest psychological desires, more than it does about like, oh, like I'm some like, you know, thrillist extremist person. Like it could just be more about like, I never got this kind of attention from my other relationships, and just to feel like this strong like dominating energy makes me feel really desired, and that turns me on. Does that make sense? So it's not about 100%. So much like plug me, it's fun. It's like and like, wow, you want me so much that you just have to do this to me, and that's really a turn on for me. So I'm just giving like examples here, but
no, and you know, I too had my experiences with kink and BDSM, and what I found is that they are probably some of the most caring and like advanced.
Like, is this okay? Is this touch?
Yeah. And it, you know, like the whips and chains thing, like the Rihanna song, it's 100% the opposite. It's like they're very orderly. They check in. They have equipment that's clean, like, and they're almost like, you know, my partner calls it like sex nerds, like just totally about all the different islands. And they're like, I'm aware of that island, and here it's like they're world travelers, and they like, I don't do that. I don't go here. And they can communicate this. And I was just like kind of floored by the communication. And, you know, that in itself made me kind of like, well, weightlifters are kind of like that too. We're fitness nerds. And so I was able to.
I mean, like, okay, so fitness is a great example, right? Because most people can relate to that. So it's like, if you've never gone down this path before of doing intimacy work, of studying your sexuality, of studying other people's sexualities that are different than your own, of studying the whole world of like kink and BDSM and alternative sexualities, and then you go and like you're in a dungeon for the first time and somebody's like trying to whip you, you're like, oh my God, what's happening? This is traumatic.
You're like,
right?
No, we're good.
Right, but it's really actually an advanced form, an advanced synthesis of all of these different practices, but just put into play. And so that's why we call it playtime, is because you're essentially just playing with this energy and playing with this power dynamic in exchange. But everybody's really, really, really adamant about safe, sane, and consensual, because again, the stronger the boundaries are, the more freedom that we have to explore. I feel like with a lot of guys, they see boundaries as like, or commitments and things like that as obligations. Like, this is a liability, and if something's strapping me down, then it's something I have to carry, and I don't want to be responsible for it. When the reality is that taking that responsibility, taking the initiative, taking all of these, like building all these boundaries are going to be the thing that liberates you to be able to do these fun things. So it's like, yeah, I found that people in the kink and BDSM community are, like you said, some of the best communicators, and they're very clear about their boundaries because they know who they are. Whereas like people I've dated who are not as much in that community or a little bit more vanilla, tend to really struggle with these things. And I found it just to be so interesting because it seemed to me like that should be the norm, and this should be like the unusual thing where like people don't know how to talk about these things. But I don't know. Totally. That's just me.
No, I'm so with you, because I mean, one of them too is like the complete misunderstanding of dominance and submission. Like, I think Dossie Easton, like I read her bits of her work on like being a bottom is a choice, you know, submitting.
It is.
What I found is actually, I love submitting to the right dominating energy. And I, as a guy, that's sort of like saying, I surrender and quit life. That's what it says in their head. But when you experience something like that, where you're like, I feel completely taken care of, it was like this out of this world psychedelic experience for me. And I came back and I was like, holy shit, I understand now. Like, I understand, you know, like when you find like, you know, an acro, you find that perfect balance point, you're like, let's not move.
You're like, yeah, let's just stay here. So that subspace is so yummy. It's like, I think, it's just the release of responsibility. It's somebody taking care of you. And to the uneducated or unapprised observer, it looks like the person who's the dom has all the power in the situation. But actually, in a healthy scene or situation, it would be the sub that has all the power, because they're the one that's requesting the act. They're the one that puts boundaries around it. They're the one who can stop at any time, right? And especially if you're, you know, in a community or in a dungeon or something, like if something happens, there's people around you who will come to your aid.
They will know what's happening because they can spot it a mile. Like that person doesn't look like they're in a good space.
All of these things, right? And so, and we all try to be very aware of like the psychological implications. So it's not that we're just gonna like do this crazy thing to the person and leave. So, I feel like this is that kind of play is really just an advanced form of these kinds of dynamics, and it may not be for everybody, but I think the principles at their core are absolutely necessary wherever you're at in your journey, whether you're married or you're poly or you're single and dating and single and not dating or anything. Like you can still cultivate that intimacy and relationship with your own sexual energy, and when and if and how these other people come into your life, you'll be on that much more solid of a platform to be able to negotiate, handle, and then enjoy and have really, really positive sexual and intimate experiences and relationships.
Man, that was, I mean, I think that is a beautiful place to just say to be continued, because
sure.
You know, like, you know, we opened up this conversation and there's so many different avenues for what you're doing, and it sounds like you are a good space, like you're a good person to just even consult about this stuff. So
thank you, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I try to be a pretty open person. I'm pretty comfortable with all of these things now. It took me a long time to get here. You know, I was kind of a closet freak for like 7-8 years, and then it took me even more years after that to find a partner who I was really comfortable sharing these things with, and then a few more years after that to where I finally got some of these experiences under my belt. So I've just learned so much throughout it all, and you know, in navigating the the dating world, I just feel like if more men especially started to explore these principles for themselves, they'd have a lot better time meeting a woman, because it's less about like or just meeting another partner. I don't want to make it so heteronormative. For two people to come together and connect, just knowing who you are, what your boundaries are, these are my desires, this is what I want, and it just makes the conversation so much easier. It doesn't have to be like a business negotiation. Right. But if you think about it, like Apple has you sign like a gazillion page agreement just to stream its music. Like, why can't you have a conversation about sex with the person you're sleeping with? You know, like
that's true, right? That's like the most intimate thing you could. Well, one of them.
The most intimate thing you could do. Like, you know, I'm not saying like write up a 130-page contract, but I'm just saying maybe have a conversation about it. And if that conversation is really, really a difficult thing for you, then you need to maybe slow down and do some work.
and that's probably like, go back to basic training, right?
Go back to basics.
Don't go playing soccer if you've never kicked the ball.
Yeah, you're not going to go in the gym and lift like 140 pounds the first day you're there. You're going to like hire a trainer. You're going to take some classes. You're going to give yourself rest breaks. You're going to come back to it. You're going to try some other sports and things, right? You got to figure it out. And so people look at this as like a one and done thing. Like, I fulfilled the fantasy, but no, this is really like a lifelong practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Man. So we covered boundaries, getting back into the body. So embodiment and boundaries, it sounds like that is the foundation of what you're teaching, and then bringing it into higher level teaching where people can actually apply it outward and like, with other people, where it gets complicated.
Right. Soft sex is first and foremost and always for yourself, right? So from that space, we honor our own autonomy. We then honor somebody else's autonomy too.
That's a good mantra. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, we each have our own sovereignty, and so people who do not recognize that, or people who do not align with those principles, they may not have the same verbiage or terminology that I do, but the energy will be felt. And so I'm just no longer in a position to be welcoming of anybody who doesn't uphold those principles, because I've just found that the damage in my relationships is not worth it to either me or to the other person. Like even when things go south or the relationship ends, these principles of sovereignty can also lead to a conscious uncoupling as well too. It doesn't have to be like a destruction disaster, like everybody hates each other. It can just be like, oh, I'm now seeing that we're growing apart and your needs are not what my needs are, and so we need to separate. There's still pain in that, but it's not like, it's not so personal.
Oh man, the self-destruct, like to the bitter end model versus conscious, that's a whole nother topic. Conscious and conscious,
Yeah, we can talk about that too. So I welcome any questions.
Where can people find you?
I offer free 30-minute consults. So if you just go to my website, missykai.yoga/consult, or you can just connect with me on Instagram, like shoot me a direct message either at Boudoir Yoga or The Body Intuitive. You can connect with me there. So either probably my website or Instagram are good places. And I just find that like even just having a conversation about these things can be really illuminating for people. But it is a very personal and very deep process. So I really encourage people to find a mentor in this space. If the things I said really resonate, I am happy to guide you in that. And there's other great professionals out here doing this kind of work too, whether they're sex therapists or they're coaches or they're, trauma experts or, body workers like myself. There's a lot of different angles to come at it. And so I also want to give people a little bit of encouragement, say if it's not perfect the first time, like just keep going, because sometimes it takes a while. And that's okay. Yeah. And I know it's frustrating and I know it's hard, but just keep going. This is a lifelong practice. So there's no rush,
Dang. I mean, people DM her, get in like a consult, like just get the combos. Cause I know a ton of people in fitness and movement, they're dancing on that line. Cause that's where I did for a long time. I was like, this is something I don't want to do. And then you just jump me like, oh, it's just like anything. After your first workout, you're like, why didn't I do it?
Why didn't I do that sooner? Yeah. Sometimes it takes people a while. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it will, and so, again, just going back to the first part of our conversation where we're talking about like men have different mental and cultural obstacles to overcome before they can even get to a point where they're open to this stuff. So like we said, unfortunately, that usually is a painful incident. So, if that is you right now and you are going through some kind of pain, just know that it doesn't have to be that way forever. And that feeling can change. It will take a little bit of work. It might not be your fault. It will take a little bit of work, but it can be better. So, don't shy away from that responsibility. You'll be better for it.
Man. Well, so are you located in California? Like which part of?
Yeah, so I'm based in West Los Angeles, which I call East Santa Monica sometimes. But yeah, so I basically live in Santa Monica, and so I see people here in my office, and I also see people all over the world online through Zoom, just like we're chatting right now. So And I've had really great success with both for, you know, physical rehabilitation and then also for sovereign sexuality coaching. You know, with the soft sex coaching, a lot of it is, you know, dialogue, but a lot of times we'll also do meditation and breath work, and you know, I'll give them journaling prompts and things like that too. So
yeah, start following her on IG, check out her stories, and she'll show you stuff about some of the group stuff, right, that you do.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, connect with me there, and then also you can subscribe to my email list where I will fingers crossed be launching a sovereign sexuality blog soon, where there will be like curated content and things, so people can, it can be more of like a closed community around it than Instagram, because I find that, again, we're just creating a container, so I'm trying to move it off of Instagram and start my own thing too. So if you want to join that list and support that, that would be amazing. And you will be so welcomed.
Damn. Well, Missy, thank you for, I hope this is the first of many conversations, but you
Thank
know,
you.
for now, I think this is a lot of good info for people to just, you know, see if that helps, because that's all it is. It's just, it's our birthright to just, you know, feel different things in this life. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Brandon, for suggesting that we have this conversation and for opening yourself up and asking such great questions where I can, you know, just ramble on forever. So I really enjoyed this. I'd love to speak again. So anytime.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, I hope you have a great day, and I'll look forward to next time. Okay.
Okay.
Cool. Talk soon. Bye.
Oh, you can just hit
Okay.
I got
I'll
off.
stop the recording.
Okay. I was like, I don't know if you actually